Those of you that know me are aware that I was trained by Jesuits, and they always insist before you do a presentation that you have to tell a story, and you have to involve a case study to make the presentation more powerful. So we'll begin with a story, since we're talking about alcoholism in the elderly, an age-old disease in old age. So here's the story. You heard about the fourth grade teacher who wanted to instruct her class about morals. So she asked them to go home, sit down with their family, get a story from the family, and construct a moral from it. A daunting project. The next day the class assembled, and she said, okay, who wants to go first? Little girl Mary had her hand up. She said, yes, Mary, what's your family story with a moral? She said, well, my dad's a chicken rancher. Last week we got all the eggs that the chickens had laid, put them in a laundry basket, got in the pickup, drove to market, hit a bump, the basket flew up, several of the eggs broke on the roof of the pickup truck. And the teacher said, what's the moral of this story? And Mary said, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Another little girl had her hand up, Joni. She said, Joni, what's your moral from your family story? She said, my daddy's a chicken rancher, and last week we took 12 eggs that were fixing to hatch into chicks to sell them in town, and only 9 of the 12 hatched. And the teacher said, what's the moral of your story? And she said, don't count your chickens until they're hatched. And way in the back of the class was mischievous little Johnny. He was busting out of his desk. He was the only one with his hand up. The teacher reluctantly called on him, and he said, last night, teacher, I sat down with my dad. He told me about his brother Bob, my Uncle Bob. And during the war, Uncle Bob was a fighter pilot. He was flying a mission. His plane got hit, and he had to bail out. And in the cockpit, he had a bottle of whiskey and a machine gun. So he grabbed both of them, and as he parachuted out, he landed in the middle of 100 enemy soldiers, took his machine gun out. He killed 80 of them until he ran out of bullets. Then took a knife out of his pants pocket, killed another 10 until the blade broke, and he strangled the last 10 with his bare hands. Now, this is a fourth grade class. Some of the kids were crying. The teacher was exasperated. And finally the teacher said, little Johnny, what is the moral of your story? And he said, don't mess with my Uncle Bob when he's drunk. Okay? Now, we all get a tickle out of that story because I think it's about the unpredictable and belligerent and violent behavior that people can manifest when they're intoxicated. But let's change the subject to a case study. So let's look at a 79-year-old gentleman, widowed gentleman, who has a history of hypertension and diabetes, and he's admitted into the hospital because he feels weak and dizzy. And when he's admitted, his blood pressure's up, his pulse is up, his blood sugar's 355, although he declares adamantly that he's been taking his blood pressure medicines and his insulin. And they get some additional history from his daughter. What do you know about your dad? She said, well, the last few months he hasn't been answering his phone. And when I've seen him lately, the house is just in great disarray and disordered. And he's a meticulous gentleman. His hygiene's dropped off. Not sure he's eating right. And the astute physician says, is it possible that your dad's drinking? Oh, no. He doesn't abuse alcohol. He never has. And then 2 days later, this gentleman becomes extremely agitated, very shaky, and he actually has a withdrawal seizure. They discover from a best friend that this gentleman's been consuming a bottle of whiskey a day since his wife passed away 9 months ago. So he's now transferred after being stabilized and treated for his alcohol withdrawal seizure. And once his blood pressure and glucose are improved, he's now transferred to a geriatric alcohol treatment unit. So we've got the case study. Let's kind of proceed. This is our goal, a long, healthy, happy life, although we might quickly ascertain that perhaps this centenarian is addicted to nicotine. Aging to perfection, I think, is what we all seek. But we have to be a wee bit careful because, we really age in two ways, don't we? We age chronologically, that's our birth date, and then we age physiologically, our physical function. And I think we're becoming more and more aware that we can accelerate our aging process by what we do, what we eat, how we live. We can accelerate it or we can slow it down. So that's what we're going to address today and have a little outline. Okay, I'm an outline kind of guy. The next half hour or so we're going to kind of look at 6 different areas about alcoholism in the elderly. Now, substance abuse is not a new problem. In fact, if you look at the book of Genesis, chapter 9, verse 20, you'll read that Noah was drunk with wine. Okay, so prehistory tells us about intoxication. I think what baffles me as a physician is the mystery of why someone would initiate and persist in an obviously self-destructive behavior. And if you're a scientist, you say, what is it that, starts this off and perpetuates it? And if you're a clinician, the question you'd ask is, what can we possibly do to modify this self-destructive behavior and curb it? But I'm convinced that I'm going to go to my grave mystified by this particular illness. I had a very rude awakening to substance abuse treatment. I was a military doctor for a long time, and my first day in private practice, my first inpatient at a private psychiatric hospital here in San Antonio was a 65-year-old crack cocaine addict and dealer. And I just had never encountered anything like that in military service, so it was a kind of a quick awakening. Well, let's kind of start. We'll start with the end first. Since I'm a military guy, they always say, make sure you tell people what you want them to know, then tell them again, and at the end, repeat it. So for those of you that are on a short leash, these are our simple 3 objectives today in looking at alcoholism in the elderly. Number 1, please be suspicious. Always suspect it. We tend to gloss over it as clinicians. We tend to minimize it. I mean, when we think about an elderly person, I think many of us have a kind of an idealistic, sweet grandmother type in our mind. But please be extra suspicious when you see elderly people have unexpected or mysterious, abrupt declines. Okay? Think about it. It's always got to be in the differential diagnosis. Number 2, as all of us age, we change. We change dramatically physiologically.